What if your boss walks up to you and asks you to build a pivot table using 2 or more lists? What would you do? This video will show you how to connect multiple lists using PowerPivot and show you how to build a simple automated dashboard. Let's get into it by taking a quick walk through our data. Now, I'm not going to waste time with a long-winded description because the data is very straightforward. Besides, you can pause the video if you want to observe anything or download a copy if you'd like to follow along. The only thing you need to know is our sample data uses 2 sheets, an order sheet and customer sheet. On the order sheet, you can see the company keeps track of such details like categories, geographical region, along with some relevant numbers like sales, profit, etc. Over on the customer sheet, you can see we keep track of the person's name along with some demographic data. Now, moving forward, whenever you work with lists, you want to make sure your list has column headings, preferably in a bold font. There are no duplicates, no typos, no blanks, extra spaces, and if possible, everything has been broken down into its smallest possible piece. And if not, you probably have to clean your data using something along the lines of Power Query, but that's for a different video. Another key concept when working with lists is to have one topic per sheet. For example, a sheet dedicated for orders, another for the customers, another for products, etc. But even after you meet all those conditions, the most important step in this whole entire process is to have a common field between your lists because that field will act like a bridge between your lists. So going back to our data, notice the common field between our lists is the customer ID, which means we can now connect these lists in PowerPivot when we get to that point here in a few moments. Getting back on point, the next step is to convert our lists into Excel tables. The reason is PowerPivot likes to work with tables, so we want to give PowerPivot what it expects. To create your table, first click somewhere in the body of the list, then click Insert, Table, click OK, then in the upper left-hand corner, rename your table to something more practical, in this case, Orders. Then do a rinse and repeat on your other list. So we'll jump over here to the customer sheet, click Insert, Table, and let's rename this table as well. Say something like Customers. All right, now that our tables have been created, we're ready to connect them in PowerPivot. To start, you want to make sure that PowerPivot has been enabled. So if you don't see it up here on the ribbon, you'll need to activate it because it's an add-in. To do that, go under File, Options, Add-ins, look for the drop-down, choose Comms, click Go, and in a dialog box, check the option for PowerPivot. All right, now that PowerPivot has been enabled, we need to add our tables to the data model. In simple terms, a data model is just a bunch of connected tables. So let's click in our Orders table, and then from the PowerPivot tab, click Add to Data Model. Give Excel a moment to work its magic, and you'll see the PowerPivot window open, and the data from the Orders table has been added in. The next step is to add our second table, in this case the Customers. So how about we bounce back to Excel, click in our Customers table, then click PowerPivot, and we can add this table to the data model as well. In PowerPivot, if you look on the lower left-hand side, you'll see both tables have been added, so the next step is to connect them. To connect your tables, you'll need to create what's known as a table relationship. In simple terms, a table relationship means you're able to pull data from across multiple tables. So let's go up here and click on Diagram View, and we'll see both our tables. Now, all you need to do is click and drag the common field to create the relationship. So in our case, we're using the customer ID. From the customers table, let's drag the customer ID field over on top of the customer ID field in the orders table. PowerPivot will then show you a line connecting the tables. Without getting too deep, this line is showing what's known as a one-to-many relationship. And what that means is one item on one table talks to many items on another table. For example, one customer can have many orders. Moving on, now that we created our relationship, we're now ready to build our pivot table, and there are a few ways to do that. For example, you can create the pivot table directly from PowerPivot by clicking Pivot Table and then adding it to a new sheet. Or if you close out of PowerPivot, when you're in Excel, you can create the pivot table by choosing Insert, Pivot Table from Data Model. In real life, the choice is yours, but for today, because we're already in PowerPivot, how about we create a pivot table and add it to a new worksheet? Looking over here on the left, you can see both your tables, and now it's just a matter of building the pivot table. Okay, for this next part, as we build our pivot tables, let's not be too concerned about making them practical. Rather, let's focus on the big picture, which is to give you an idea of what's possible. How about we kick things off and create a pivot table that pulls data from across our tables? Perhaps we want to see the total sales from the devices our customers use. So we'll drag the device field into the rows quadrant and then our sales field into the values quadrant. Okay, now let's add another pivot table by going up and clicking on Insert, Pivot Table from Data Model, placing it on the same worksheet. For this pivot table, how about we drag our homeowner status into the rows quadrant and drag our profit field into the values quadrant? Why? Why not? Let's go for it and add one more pivot table from the data model. Let's go with something bland like putting the product category here and the total sales into this quadrant. Okay, from here, how about we create some charts starting with our first pivot table? Let's go up and click on Insert, Pivot Chart, and we'll go with this simple column chart. Then let's do a rinse and repeat for our second pivot table. And how about we go with the often maligned pie/donut graph for this one? And then for the last pivot table, let's add another column graph. Now the charts are complete, let's add in some interactivity by adding a slicer. So we can go up here and click on the Pivot Table Analyze tab, then insert our slicer. And for today, let's say we want to look at our data by the customer source. It's important to mention that by default, the slicer isn't connected to all of our pivot tables. So let's right-click on the slicer, choose Report Connections, check the pivot tables we want to connect. Now, if we click on the slicer, you'll see all the relevant data is being displayed across all three of them. And that's how it's done. Now, here's another Excel video for you.